By the one-way streets from northeastern Ohio, USA, and this is the Purple Kniff from Los Angeles, California.
Anyway, I do have the hearing that Andy No testified at, that lying ass fucking embedded with violent far-right terrorists, white supremacists, fucking thugs and shit, this grifter Andy No, that again testified in front of Congress. Like I said, if we have time, after all the stuff I have queued up, after news from the revolutionary struggle, maybe we'll go through that in our last hour. One more track from the Insomniacs, fam. Estrus Records, 10-inch vinyl even. How's that for timing, fam? So, like I said, we're going to cover this goddamn disgusting House committee hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism. But before we do, we should probably take a look at a little proper context for the lying, disgusting piece of shit fascist grifter who embeds himself with far right-wing white supremacist terrorists and thugs by the name of Andy No. This is a piece, this is coverage from some time back from Some More News, but it's recently he re-upped it to Some More News, Some More News Clips is the name of the channel. And it's just, as you can see, about 5 minutes of relevant and important information to exactly who Andy No is. And I think we should take a look at it before we do any type of coverage of the Senate committee hearing. So, with no further whatever, this is Cody, Some More News, and his coverage of Andy No.
We haven't even talked about the mountains of misinformation and propagandists that were able to lull America into ignoring major extremist groups in the country, and how a lot of these grifter sites like OANN and the Daily Caller and Fox News are literally designed to queef past FCC rules and propaganda laws. And maybe we should fix those laws? But even with the laws we have now, there should definitely be investigations into people like Andy No for spending his entire career doing PR for the Proud Boys, a group Canada just labeled terrorists. If you know Andy, then you know that he's been using selective editing and photography to spin Antifa clashes with white supremacists as acts of unprompted leftist violence. Like the time he posted a video of Antifa attacking, quote, people on a bus with a hammer, without mentioning that the innocent bus victims were actually a white supremacist group who, as seen in previous photos, actually had the hammer to begin with. And when I showed him another angle and asked him where the hammer came from, he blocked me. Hi, Andy. How's that British accent that's fake going for you?
Yeah, fake as fuck. And I just want to point out that what happened was people shouted things at these people on the bus, and they came out after taunting them and inviting them to violence, came out with a hammer to fucking hit somebody. The anti-fascists took the hammer from them, and then instantly photos were taken, and it went viral and hit across all kinds of media platforms saying that, look at the violent Antifa with the hammer and whatever. When in fact it was something that they had taken to defend them, to stop themselves from being beat with it. Anyway, and it was so humiliating. Like, They painted themselves as such victims when really they were just totally incompetent fucking violent terrorist fascist thugs that were going to beat someone with a hammer but weren't fucking capable of holding on to it. So they decided to twist it and turn it into a lie to demonize their detractors and those that they attempted to violently assault as somehow the initiators of that assault. It was disgusting and typical of fascist fucking methodology and typical of the types of people that Andy No associates with and platforms.
Anyway, one time someone threw a milkshake at him and he claimed it gave him a brain hemorrhage and then refused to show his medical records and then set up a GoFundMe and made almost $200,000. Because he's a hack grifter, you see. Oh, also, he once helped make a list of journalists with, quote, Antifa ideologies. It was actually just journalists who followed Antifa accounts, and then that list was used by white supremacists and accelerationist terrorists as a list of people to try to hurt and kill. Oh, also, there's footage of him hanging out with right-wing militias as they planned an assault, so yeah.
Gotcha, okay. Huh. Yes. What's that?
We're just checking which way the wind was blowing so we don't spray ourselves.
Yeah, that would suck.
There's 100 of them there? I'll take the first 3.
Let's go get a beer and say fuck it.
Huh? Okay.
I know a lot about fighting.
How many are there?
If we waltz up in there,
They're all sitting there drinking and waiting.
How many are there?
They know we're coming because you put it on.
Oh, they.
okay. So we stroll by there. Are they coming out?
No. But they saw me and they know I'm telling. So
Let's just walk by there.
No.
The thing is, he's saying there's like a 50 or 100 guys out in the parking lot.
It's not.
I don't think we're going to be able to get inside.
A bunch of people with no jobs. They don't care about going
to
there.
the block. I'm down for that.
You see him in there? Just smiling and waiting to film, but not actually filming as members of Patriot Prayer stood around and planned a May Day attack on a local restaurant that they suspected contained Antifa members dining. You can hear them literally talking about spraying people with gas. The resulting attack would leave one woman unconscious. This was led by Patriot Prayer big shot Joey Gibson, who would go on to storm the Oregon Capitol in January with other members, one of which now charged with assaulting police officers because they are a terrorist group. People literally planning violent attacks on businesses and government buildings, and just people dining, while Andy No quietly followed along like their personal PR photographer. And while there's like countless articles breaking down the many lies he's made, or the many false claims he's retweeted, for some reason, this motherfucker just published a book of more lies and typos and testified before Congress.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirono, and members of the committee. Antifa is not a myth.
While wearing his best fake British accent, too. It's fake. The accent is fake. He's a fraud. It's a fake accent. This pathological liar and weirdo was invited by Ted Cruz, another weirdo and liar, to talk about the Antifa menace back in August, roughly 6 months before the US Capitol was violently attacked by, not Antifa. In fact, they were so not Antifa that they were actually the people Antifa opposes, also known as the, FA. Jeez, it's almost like This whole time, there was an uptick in white supremacist extremist violence, and instead of addressing it, politicians focused on the counter-protesters to those groups. And a lot of people, like Andy Ngo, spent their careers aiding those extremists by unfairly labeling Antifa as the real problem. And maybe we now need to recognize that and never, ever, 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 ever listen to the grifters who tried to tell us that right-wing violence wasn't an issue and investigate whether or not they knew at the time they were lying about the threat of Antifa being somehow worse than all the Nazi militias brewing in this country and dig into their associations with these terrorists.
Oh, Cody.
I will now recognize myself for an opening statement and emphasize the importance of this day. Over the course of the last 4 years, every corner of the United States has felt the impact of rise of domestic terrorism. Communities of faith, peaceful protesters, and even the United States Congress itself have been attacked by domestic terrorists. The executive branch has an array of statutory authorities to prevent attacks and bring charges against domestic terrorists, including those that are white supremacists. It is abundantly clear, however, that despite pleas from Congress and the American people, these tools have not been fully utilized nor implemented effectively with the full force of law and all the available resources. We must focus on our federal government on the goal of eradicating those homegrown threats in communities across the country. Domestic terrorists pose a clear and deadly threat to the well-being of all Americans. During the past 2 years, this committee has examined the federal response to domestic terrorists each time a horrific and tragic white supremacist attack has taken place. As just one sober example, in August of 2019, the shooting spree at a Walmart in El Paso, the home of our colleague, the Honorable Veronica Escobar, left 22 people dead and 24 more wounded, marking the third deadliest act of violence by domestic extremists in more than 50 years. It's certainly troubling that the core of his hatred was based on language and ethnicity. It is so troubling that there have been so many shocking tragedies in recent years, from the deadly rampage at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, religion and immigration issues, to the 2012 white supremacist attack on the Sikh temple in Milwaukee. So sad that I have been on this committee through all of these horrific attacks, and to the brutal murder of 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Even our most hallowed houses of worship have become targets of violent and hateful domestic terrorists. The funeral for these precious souls was a powerful statement that we would not tolerate that violence, and was taken to another level when President Barack Obama sang the song, Amazing Grace. For all of those who want to equivocate about the nature of this threat or make false comparisons, take a moment to pause and reflect on that statistic. Over the last 10 years, 75% of all murders have resulting from domestic terrorism have been the result of right-wing extremists. Attempts to equate white supremacy to anarchists, activists, and other groups who are opposed to white nationalism and other domestic terror ring as hollow today as they did following the alt-right protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. No, there are not good people on both sides. On January 6th, former President Trump directed a group of his followers, which included an array of hate-filled extremists, to attack the Capitol and Congress at a time when we were fulfilling our sacred constitutional duty in certifying electors. Our citizens have repeatedly seen and have been horrified by the images from that day, including police officers being beaten and bloodied, beatings which caused the death and serious lasting injuries. There are no both sides in this debate. We must not be misled by efforts to divert the attention and accountability for these acts of right-wing violence and terror. Any attempt to do so, for instance, says that the real problem is something called Antifa, is irresponsible and belittles the seriousness of the threat of extreme right-wing violence and misidentifies who the perpetrators predominantly are in this community. As the FBI director said unequivocally, white supremacists are the most lethal threat for domestic violence in our country. Among domestic terrorists, white supremacy has no equivalent. I ask all the members of the subcommittee to join me today in denouncing domestic terrorism, including white supremacy, in all forms. I wish we would just take an oath or raise our hands. With this hearing today, the subcommittee comes together again to seek answers to why our federal government has not taken the steps necessary to address the rising specter of right-wing and white nationalist domestic terrorism. At the beginning of the last Congress, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing entitled Hate Crimes and the Rise of White Nationalism. During that hearing, we heard from a diverse panel of witnesses who described both the rise of white nationalism and the shortcomings in the current enforcement regime, what was clear then and is clear now is that our current approach is not working. Enough is enough. It is time for the action, and I look forward to hearing from today's panelists on what federal law enforcement must do to swiftly address the rise of domestic terrorism and how Congress can help. I believe that there are well-reasoned and measured steps that we can take, such as passing Representative Brad Snyder's Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that would focus the federal government's resources on the continuing threats to terrorize and kill Americans. With domestic terrorism, our country has suffered horrendous and repeated attacks on our people and our democracy, attacks not from beyond our borders, but from within. And as well, we saw on January 6th, those attacks have been on those innocent law enforcement officers standing in the gap to protect the citadel of democracy. The wounds are deep, but our resolve is strong. We must not allow this to continue. And as we examine this very important time in our history, we must recognize the very importance of the work that we have to do. The nature of the domestic terrorist threats against our country must be examined, and let us do so today. As we proceed today, I'd like to offer the words of Abraham Lincoln. The world will little note, nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. The brave men and living and dead have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so nobly advanced. In this committee, I hope that we will finish this noble work and that we will not succumb to this kind of violence in America ever again. I yield back at this time. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure for me to serve on this subcommittee on crime, terrorism, and homeland security. And as this is the first hearing, my first hearing as ranking member of this esteemed subcommittee, I want to start out by saying how much I look forward to working with you to combat violent crime, keep our communities safe, and stand by the men and women of law enforcement. Now, when you and I spoke before, I told you I did not intend to show a video, but something in your comments, I think, causes me to want to change my mind. I'll show you in a second. Turning our attention to today's hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America, we must approach the subject with open minds and open eyes. We must acknowledge that all domestic terrorism is wrong and must not only be acknowledged, but condemned. This includes domestic terrorism labeled as right-wing or left-wing. I fear that my colleagues on the other side...
I heard that right-wing, left-wing equivocation bullshit. There is no left-wing equivalent to what we've seen from right-wing white supremacist terrorists. There is no left-wing equivalent to it. There just isn't. There is none.
Focus on right-wing domestic terrorism, and I hope that I am mistaken. However, I suppose that they would first need to admit that left-wing domestic terrorism exists. And just last year, for instance, the chairman of the whole Judiciary Committee called Antifa imaginary. I suppose our witness today, Mr. No, was beaten and continually threatened by adherents to an imaginary group.
This is just, oh my God. I'm gonna have to gather my breath and my thoughts, because this is a fucking ranking member of a Senate committee parroting the lies that Andy No has been threatened. Andy No has been insulted in many extreme ways. And there's a lot of people who deeply despise Andy No and let him know that. That's because Andy No made like kill lists and shit. He made lists of people that he labeled, in most cases spuriously and incorrectly, as being Antifa. And those people on that list were targeted for violence and terrorism and harassment. And to paint him as some type of victim of threats and whatever, people got fucking seriously hospitalized and may have even been killed because of fucking Andy No and his lies, man. And the worst that's ever happened to that piece of shit was he got punched one day and he also got a fucking milkshake to the face. Don't fall for this bullshit, fam. This Mr. Biggs from fucking Arizona. And if some random politician said that Antifa is imaginary, that's stupid framing, and there is no connection between anti-fascists and anyone in government at all whatsoever. The capitalist imperialist mechanisms that control this government despise anti-fascists because we're anti-capitalist. And maybe I'm sure I'll have plenty more to say, but as you can, so look, you can see that this is 3.5 hours. We're not going to watch 3.5 hours. There's 2 very, very long breaks that happen in this. And I've also got it at 1.25 speed, so it's playing a little fast. They're doing their little introduction stuff, and then they're going to get into, I believe it's 3 different guests. I haven't watched the whole thing. I've only skimmed it a little bit. But I just wanted to let you know, no, we're not about to go 3.5 hours of coverage on this. But keep in mind that there is just no proof. And again, there is no equivalency between white supremacist fucking terrorism and any type of supposed left-wing terrorism. Like, right-wing fucking white supremacists have been murdering people and doing mass shootings and committing violence on the street for years. And then leftists go out on the street and peacefully march and get attacked by pigs, and then it gets labeled a riot, and then the nightly news, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, it doesn't matter, will portray it as a left-wing rioting and that kind of shit, and they do that perpetually, especially throughout the George Floyd uprisings, so that far-right people think that there's some type of connection or equivalent between the George Floyd uprisings and the blatant, overt, like, sending pipe bombs to multiple people, shooting up fucking mosques and synagogues, and mass fucking violence that was committed on the Capitol and around the nation that same day. They want to act like that's somehow the same thing as when leftists are attacked by cops and labeled as rioters. Okay, and Andy Ngo swims all up in that soup. If you can believe that the imaginary fucking ongoing leftist violence and terrorism, and again, let me specify and make very, very abundantly clear that any type of activity that you've seen from the left over the last few years, and especially during the Floyd uprisings, worst case scenario, you saw property damage, which is not violence. The right wing goes out for the purpose of marching so that they can fight the Antifas or they can attack BLM activists that they've been trained to believe are violent rioters, right? Even though they're not, again, and they've just been marching peacefully and then had cops attack them. And this is nothing even remotely new. This stretches all the way back to Martin Luther King and the times of Black Power, when civil rights activists would take to the street and peacefully march, not commit any type of property damage. There wasn't the looting and that kind of shit that you may have seen examples of later. In the civil rights movement, they came out and they marched peacefully and locked arm and saying, "We shall overcome," and had fire hoses unloaded on them, had dogs unleashed on them, and in many cases were shot. And then they would show that on the nightly news that night, the response to their peaceful marches, the fire hoses, the dogs, and the shooting, and go, look what we had to do. The rioting, they didn't say the blacks. They said N-words, and Negro was a word they used a lot back then on the news. But this was all, John Birch Society and Klan propaganda that holds true to this day. It's still referenced to this day as like the riots in Harlem or the riots that happened in the response from law enforcement to riots during the civil rights movement, when I would say 99%, if not 100% of those were completely nonviolent, devoid of property damage, and only had violence unleashed on them by the pigs and the mechanisms of the state, which is ruled by the capitalist imperialist ruling class. And this is nothing new today. Okay, fam? Nothing new. And like I said, Andy Ngo is swimming in the soup of that. If you buy into the lie that there's been rioting in the streets from BLM and Antifa, then it's easy for you to believe that Andy No, who made $200,000 because he lied about the effects of a milkshake to his face. He said he had fucking brain bleed, fam, because of a milkshake to the face. And he got $200,000 out of that. $200,000 off that one grift. And that's because people are willing to believe that he's some type of victim of the violence they've been lied to and made to believe exists on the left. And then this motherfucker right here, this fucking Biggs piece of shit, wants to make correlations between the imaginary leftist terrorism and the very, very real and verifiable violent terrorism and murder coming out of the far right white supremacist fucking thuggery on the street, as backed by many people in the capitalist ruling classes. All right, I'm gonna go back to it.
Antifa laid siege to some of our cities much of last year, and I hope that we can have a thoughtful and balanced discussion about the issue of domestic terrorism. And I remain hopeful that, despite the fact that one of our witnesses here today suggested that ISIS bombed a Trump property in Turkey, I cannot decide which is worse, that a retired naval non-commissioned officer made such a suggestion on Twitter, or that it was thought appropriate to invite him here today to discuss domestic terrorism. Ideologies that fuel domestic terrorism exist all along the political spectrum. And in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, during a Unite the Right rally, James Alex Fields drove his car into counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 28 others.
Right. And where's the example? And where's the example of that? Where's the comparable example of that from the left? Where is the person on the left that drove over a bunch of people with their car? Zero. Doesn't happen. Doesn't exist. Leftists get run over by right-wingers in fucking cars. That's a thing. But there is no fucking example of that you can compare to on the left. It does not exist. That's not to say that Antifa is imaginary. But he gives the example of Alex Fields and says, we got to take real off of saying, basically talking about the Floyd uprisings. I don't know that he came out directly said that, but Antifa over the last year. He's talking about the Floyd uprisings. No one in the Floyd uprisings drove over anyone with their cars or murdered anyone. They got murdered by a piece of shit kid named Kyle Rittenhouse, a couple of them. And the talking point on that, fam, is that to this day, you'll see in the right-wing threads when they defend Kyle Rittenhouse that he was defending people from destroying the city. No one was destroying anything at the time. People were marching peacefully for Black lives, and Kyle Rittenhouse shot one of them in the back of the head, and they managed to shoot another person dead, and then another person in the arm when they tried to stop him from his killing rampage. But to this day, they talk about destroying the cities. Not one city has been destroyed, fam. Not one. Not one. Anytime you hear any right-winger talk about they destroyed cities, you need to keep in mind what city was literally destroyed and set on fire. There were some instances in a maybe one, at the most 2-block radius that saw some type of property damage, and we even saw, the cop shop in Minneapolis was burnt down. By the way, only one person has been charged that I know of in relation to the cop shop being burnt down in Minneapolis, and it was a fucking boogaloo boy who was trying to kick off a second civil war and blame it on BLM and Antifa. So this guy's trying to act like that piece of shit, Alex Fields, who was directly connected to American Guard, which is now Patriot Front. When that murdering piece of shit did what he did, that there's somehow something or some type of activity on the left to compare that to. There is not. There is not. And any right-winger that might be watching this right now, what's the example? What's the example of us taking a car and running over a bunch of patriots? Doesn't exist, and we wouldn't do it. Fuck this Biggs motherfucking lying propagandist, fucking high-paid shill piece of shit.
Acceptable. And comments made today and other times since that point need to be put into perspective. And with that, let's go with the video if we may, Madam Chair.
Well, they got video. What's this?
You may proceed.
Thank you. Please proceed with the video.
Excuse me, excuse me. Excuse me, excuse me. And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. No, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington?
No.
What about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture. And you had people, and I'm not
No, we're not. No one's changing culture.
Nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists. Okay?
No, you didn't.
And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly.
No, they didn't.
In the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers.
No, you didn't.
See them come with the black outfits.
So what?
With the helmets and with
So
the
what?
baseball bats.
No, they didn't.
You had a lot of bad people in the other group.
No, you didn't.
So the point is, the previous president, the former President Trump, called out neo-Nazis and white nationalists and said they should be condemned. I think there's no one in this room that would disagree with that statement.
He gathers from that. That Donald Trump called out neo-Nazis. As he makes up a bunch of lies and demonize fucking leftists, makes them out to be thugs. People that were there, I want to redraw your attention or your memory to Cornel West saying that had it not been for anti-fascists and anarchists, he would have been squashed like a cockroach. The people that Donald Trump demonized as being thugs with bats and black clothes and masks were there to defend black and brown people from the white supremacist, white nationalist, terrorist fucking thugs that came there to wreak havoc and fucking violence on human beings. That was their purpose. They marched earlier that night, the night before, saying blood and soil and the Jews will not replace us. And then the next day they came with all their shields and their helmets and all their weapons and their guns to fucking do violence to their political fucking enemies. And one of them took it to the extreme and ran over a whole bunch of people. And then Trump makes a big long speech talking about how leftists were fucking violent and fucking whatever. And then this piece of shit takes that as, look, he discounted white supremacists. White supremacists always do that. Oh, yeah. The people who did that murder thing and got caught. Yeah, I denounce that. That's horrible. But the commies, man, the Black Lives Matter, national, extremists, man. What about them? They'll denounce the individual that does the violent terrorist act on the right. They'll even say, yeah, screw white supremacy. I denounce white supremacy. As though, and the reason they'll say that, I denounce white supremacy, is because they're ultimately, what they're saying is, white supremacy is only defined by hardcore Klan members and like neo-Nazi boneheads, right? It ignores the reality of systemic white supremacy in Western culture and in capitalist imperialism, Western capitalist imperialism. Astounding to me, fam. That this motherfucker takes from what Trump said as the takeaway from that is like he made some type of deep-throated denunciation of white supremacy, when in actuality what he did is gave full-throated fucking advocations and reutterances of far-right white supremacist talking points. You can say, oh, I denounce white supremacy, and then go do white supremacist stuff. And they're very keen to always do that so that they can say, oh, see, I denounced it.
That same year, we saw politically inspired domestic terrorism that actually hit much closer to our home. As Republican members gathered at Eugene Simpson Stadium Park in Alexandria, Virginia to practice for an annual congressional baseball game for charity, James Thompson Hodgkinson's age 66, fired at least 70 rounds from a handgun and rifle at the congressman, staff, and others at the park. 5 people were injured during the assault, including Republican Whip Steve Scalise, who was in critical condition and underwent multiple surgeries.
Again, and they always bring this guy up. And then they say he was a Bernie supporter. Like, he didn't work for the Bernie campaign. He wasn't a fucking volunteer for Bernie. He's just a dude who shared some stuff in support of Bernie, who went out and did this really awful fucking thing. He didn't organize with any leftist groups. He didn't have direct connections with any type of leftist groups whatsoever. But he went and he shot a Republican. And this is forever and ever their example of the leftist fucking extremism and terrorism. When even if we are gonna, for the sake of some fucking twisted argument, take ownership of this piece of shit, which I'm never going to do ever, because it would be inaccurate to do so. But even if that was somehow directly connected to the left, it's one example. It literally happened years ago now. And since that time, there have been numerous accounts of multiple fucking mass murders, bombings, and fucking street thug violence on the street, right? I said street twice. But again, so not even fucking comparable. Jesus, we're only 14 minutes into this, and it's 3.5 hours. I doubt we'll go through even the whole thing, even at fast pace, but pretty sure he's about to get to where he's going to introduce some of the guests. Maybe we'll go through get to the first break, maybe, and we'll see where we're at on time.
The Commonwealth Attorney for the City of Alexandria, a Democrat, concluded, quote, "The evidence in this case establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that the suspect, fueled by rage against Republican legislators, decided to commit an act of terrorism," close quote. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter. We also cannot forget the attack that took place in 2012 at the Family
Okay, so
Research
if you're totally opposed to right wingers, you're most likely going to be in support of some liberal or maybe some left of center fucking progressive like Bernie. But even by his own words, this fucking asshole, fascist, propagandist piece of shit Biggs, even by his own description, the guy was motivated by his hate of right-wing politicians, not his support for Bernie Sanders. That was an afterthought. Oh, this guy who fucking hated these right-wing scumbags also happened to like Bernie. So, I bet he liked chocolate, and I bet he also liked sandwiches, and I bet he liked sunsets too. Does that make them fucking relevant to why he shot those people? No, it doesn't. And I'm going to say this right now. Any fucking leftist that's even like hinting at the notion of possibly going out and shooting a politician, do not fucking do it. It will backfire. They will create all kinds of legislation that will demonize and incarcerate and fucking destroy the lives of the leftists you hope to fucking defend with that act. Do not ever go out and shoot a politician in the name of leftism. Please. Not because that's the right thing to say to keep me from getting blocked on YouTube, but because I do not advocate it. And no leftist, communist, or anarchist I know advocates for it, because we know, one, it will not achieve our goals. It will not end capitalism and get us anywhere closer to it. In fact, it'll, two, totally create the fucking elements necessary for the mechanisms of power to stomp down on us even harder. As you will see with the police state sort of responses to what happened in the Capitol. Not that I advocate for what happened in the Capitol or in any way in solidarity with what happened in the Capitol. These fucking idiots. They prove my point, though, these fucking fascist assholes. Their attack and their push on the Capitol is going to justify laws, draconian laws that oppress all of us. We do not do violence as a tactic on the left. It's a bullshit fucking talking point from those that do violence as a political tactic, or at the very least, people like this piece of shit who get paid to make apologies for those who do violence as political tactic.
Quote, kill as many people as he could, close quote, at the Family Research Council Center in Washington, D.C. According to the sentencing memorandum, he told the FBI he wanted to kill the people in the building and then smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich on their face. He was inspired to attack the FRC because it had been identified on Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. It was a different set of ideologies that inspired the attacks on West Coast federal buildings than those that inspired an attack on our Capitol. We've seen white and black supremacist groups inspire
You
domestic
see that? And
terrorism.
I got to stop it there. I got to stop it there, fam. This is him buying into the right-wing fucking demonization of the Southern Poverty Law Center as being the real hate group. Like, I'm sorry, Southern Poverty Law Center recognizing bigotry and racist hate and shining a light on it is not somehow something that is an advocation for or an inspiration for someone to go out and commit terrorism. So he's trying to link what this one person did, which is completely separate from any of the fucking tactical goals of any leftist, and definitely separate from any type of anything advocated by the Southern Poverty Law Center, but he's trying to connect it to the Southern Poverty Law Center, whose sole purpose is to call out bigotry and hatred and extremist violence, right? Whether you agree with all of their framing and stuff, like they've had some troublesome framing of black nationalists over the years, but that said, there is no way that the Southern Poverty Law Center should be in any way even brought up in context of what this fucking piece of shit did in this shooting. It's disgusting, fam. It's disgusting that this is going on as some type of fucking, you know, example of facts and reality. This is all supposed to be about fucking how House Committee hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism. The only domestic terrorism in this country that exists with any type of fucking demonstrable significance is right-wing extremism, is white supremacist terrorist violence. And this motherfucker's trying to act like otherwise. That the people that are the victims of that right-wing supremacist terrorist violence are somehow comparable and in the same boat as those that did the violence. It's foul.
2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Ruth, harboring views of white supremacy, took the lives of 9 congregants of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 2019 in Jersey City, New Jersey, David N. Anderson and Francine Graham shot and killed 3 people at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey. The shooters also wounded 1 customer and 2 police officers. The Jersey City Police Department detective was shot and killed by the assailants at a nearby cemetery just before the grocery store attack. David Anderson and Francine Graham, identified as Black Hebrew Israelites, which the Southern Poverty Law Center found that, quote, the extremist fringe of the Hebrew Israelite movement is black supremacist. It also wrote that the members of those groups, quote, believe that Jews are devilish imposters and openly condemn whites as evil.
You know, I'm not even going to let him talk. You know, if you want, we have video and context about the Black Hebrew Israelites, but the person that did that act had associations with Black Hebrew Israelites, but was not affiliated with them at the time. Again, it was a one-off thing that no leftist group wants anything to do with, because his tactics were totally contrary to any type of fucking leftist tactics or goals. And not that Black Hebrew Israelites are leftists. They're very fundamentalist and religiously driven, and they are in many ways bigoted. But they're also colonized people. And just because that one guy had at one time been connected to them is an unfair comparison. Again, the only thing that's consistently violent that we can count on to do murder and to do violent terrorism is far-right extremists. The 2 examples that he gave there were 2 one-off examples that literally do exist in a vacuum, each one individually. And then all the other examples he gave, which were numerous, were consistent point for point, unbroken chains of examples of right-wing terrorist murder and violence for the purpose of, gaining sort of political prominence or pushing people forward into, some type of second civil war, or to push some type of white supremacist fucking agenda, race war agenda. Let's go ahead. I've heard, this is supposed to be us covering what the fuck. I can't listen to any more of their introductions. The first person, she gave a pretty factual account of what this was all about. Biggs was a lying ass propagandist piece of shit who should be recognized as pushing fucking rhetoric that will ultimately cause people to do violence. He's a stochastic terrorist. And the people that listen to what he has to say and internalize it will go out and do will do violence to leftists and BLM activists.
When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Mr. Henderson, welcome. You may begin.
Thank you. Chairperson Jackson Lee, full committee chairman Nadler, Chairperson Biggs, and full committee member Jordan, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing today on the federal response to domestic terrorism. I'm Wade Henderson, interim president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. This hearing, in the wake of January 6th attack on the Capitol, is important. Last month's attack, fueled in part by white nationalism and anti-Semitism that has long thrived in our country, horrified us all. But for those of us who represent marginalized people, the violence did not surprise us because sadly it is not new. We are all too familiar with the ways in which white supremacy has long thrived in our country. We also know that for too long, the threat of white nationalist violence has been weaponized, not only by white supremacists, but also by laws and programs that target us rather than protect us. I'd like to offer 4 recommendations today. First, Congress must pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act without any poison pill amendments that would create a new charge and demand that federal agencies show how they are fighting white supremacist violence. Federal law enforcement already has statutes and investigative powers to combat violence fueled by white supremacy, including over 50 terrorism-related crimes and over a dozen other criminal laws. But it has lacked the will to use them, and the DTPA would help address this. Importantly, the bill would not create new domestic terrorism charges or sentence enhancements that would ultimately harm our communities. Our nation's long history of misusing its mechanisms, including the use of COINTELPRO against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the post-9/11 targeting of Arabs and Muslims, and the FBI's prioritization of Black identity extremists, makes clear that new authority would be used to expand racial profiling, undermine due process, or target political opponents, all in the name of national security. Instead, we should use existing tools to combat white supremacy without enabling new abuses. Second, Congress must identify ways to address and dismantle white supremacy in law enforcement. We know most police officers report for duty every day, determined to honor their mission. But we also know that there are officers who have actively promoted white supremacist groups that incite or use violence. White supremacy infects so many of our institutions, but its impact on policing is especially devastating. It makes us all less safe, including the police. Congress must demand a full accounting of what is being done to address white supremacy in law enforcement. And the White Supremacy in Law Enforcement Information Act is a good first step. Congress and federal agencies must also identify ways to ensure that law enforcement officers who incite racist violence are no longer welcome. Third, Congress must pass legislation and appropriations to enhance the federal response to hate crimes. White nationalist violence and other hate crime terrorizes communities on a daily basis. We also know that we do not have the accurate data necessary to effectively address it. The Jabara-Hire No Hate Act improves data and community-centered responses, but more must be done, including mandatory reporting and implementation of the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Finally, Congress must pass H.R. 40 to study the efficacy of reparations for African Americans and create a U.S. Commission for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. For over 400 years, subjugation of Black people was a major factor in American economic growth. Yet long after the end of slavery, Black people are still deprived of the benefits of that growth. If we are to address white nationalist violence, we must confront our history, including disinvestment in Black and brown communities, because it still remains with us. Congress must pass H.R. 40 and reckon and account for our history. Reparations are owed, transformation is required. Now is the time to create a shared vision for a country as good as its ideals, where all are valued. To do this, we must reckon with white supremacy that was present at our founding and persists to this day. Thank you for having me here today. I would be happy to take your questions.
Expired. Now we recognize Mr. Malcolm W. Nance for 5 minutes of testimony. Mr. Nance, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and all the members of this committee. 27 years ago, on April 19, 1995, I was a U.S. Navy Cryptologic Intelligence Chief Petty Officer aboard a Los Angeles-class submarine carrying out operations in the Eastern Hemisphere. I was sitting in the radio communication space monitoring a report from our higher headquarters. One item dominated the unclassified significant events. Truck bomb explodes in Oklahoma City, dozens killed. As a specialist in Middle East terror groups, I was convinced that one of our adversaries had infiltrated the American homeland and perpetrated a major act of violence. I was so sure that I bet an entire month's salary. I quickly lost that bet. The terrorist that conceptualized, built, and delivered the 4,500-pound ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was a decorated U.S. Army veteran named Timothy James McVeigh. He conspired with two others, including his platoon leader, Terry Nichols, to exact revenge against the government for the deaths of the Branch Davidian religious extremists in Waco, Texas. However, there was a larger ideological belief at play. McVeigh was a white supremacist who had self-radicalized. He came to believe that a race war was imminent in the United States. He used the 1978 fictional novel, The Turner Diaries, as a blueprint to ignite a civil war which would lead to a white domination of North America. The Turner Diaries, written by American neo-Nazi William Pierce, describes America as a dystopia, where Black and Hispanic crime runs rampant, 800,000 whites are mass arrested, and guns are confiscated. The fictional Errol Turner is a member of the terrorist group called The Order. In that book, a 5,000-pound truck bomb is detonated at the headquarters of the FBI in Washington, D.C., as the go sign for a war to overthrow the system. The system, which represented America, was led by the Jews, the news media, Hollywood, and liberal government politicians. The Order carries out reprisal lynchings of liberal whites they call race traitors in, quote, The Day of the Rope. The book ends when the fictional hero dies in a kamikaze airplane bombing of the Pentagon. Then came real life. McVeigh copied the described bomb and just altered the target. Another white supremacist, Robert Matthews, a close associate of Pierce, formed a terror group of the same name in the 1980s to carry out robberies, assassination, bombings, and fund the network of white supremacist terror groups, terror training camps in the rural U.S. Matthews would later be killed in a shootout with the FBI. There was a long history of anti-government extremism in our nation. That mistrust is often based on myths, conspiracy theories, paranoia, laced with a healthy dose of rebellion nostalgia. Most domestic violent extremists seek to protect and defend rights, not as they are written in the Constitution, but as they wish they had been written. They live in an alternate information space which bends them out of objective reality. Major violent extremist subclasses include the Ku Klux Klan and white heritage groups, neo-Nazi and fascist international groups, Christian identity movement groups, anti-tax extremists, anti-government militia groups, anti-abortion extremists, anti-immigrant macro-nationalists, class of civilization groups, white ethno-accelerationist groups, conspiracy theory-driven DVEs, autocritical cultist DVEs.
Do you hear that? Just real quick, fam. You hear that? Just numerous examples over a long period of time that show this as an unbroken tradition over time. And again, numerous examples of similar behaviors. Whereas the right-winger that came before, he talked about one dude that fucking had some tacit support of Bernie Sanders who shot some politicians, and then some dude who at one time was affiliated with Black Hebrew Israelites, which is not a leftist group, who went and did some fucking violent fucking terrorist murderous act. That's it. That's the only examples they had to show that there's some type of comparable left-wing terrorism, where this guy, in just like the last 30 seconds, rattled off like it seemed like a dozen examples of white supremacist terrorist violence and murder. Like, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but there's just no comparison between the two. And I want to point out, look, the right wing comes out and has come up with two things that are dubious at best, while each of these people that are like serious about really addressing fucking violent terrorism are giving you numerous factual verifiable examples of real terrorist violence. And it's all coming from far right factions and elements. All of it.
President Barack Obama would be a watershed moment that would start the consolidation of the disparate wings of the domestic violent extremist movements. But the 2016 election of President Donald Trump gave them a tribal chieftain they can all rally behind. Most right-wing extremists have poorly formed cells with limited capacity or knowledge of terrorist operations. However, many veterans in the military could lend in-depth operational planning and improvise explosive skills to any group. These groups may be amateur, but can demonstrate devastating capability if not detected in time. The former president's 2020 defeat has led to a completely new wave of DVE organization and preparedness that could potentially realize their most violent fever dream fantasies as patriotic resistance fighters straight from the movie Red Dawn. If they do not understand there is a national rejection of their behaviors, then they may feel compunction to act on that potential. We could see future attacks that make Oklahoma City bombing pale in comparison. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions, even the silly ones.
Fantastic.
I'd like to continue now with Mr. No for his 5 minutes. Mr. No, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
This guy's a fucking scumbag, man.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and members of the committee. Being a journalist from Portland, Oregon,
no, you're not.
I know domestic terrorism well.
No, you don't.
Since
yes, you do. Okay, I just got to start off like, this is going to be hard because I hate this fucking scumbag, man. But I just want to start off by saying, imagine going and sitting in front of Congress and testifying in front of Congress in a fake accent. Like, the dude is not from fucking England, man. He doesn't have a fucking British accent. And I will also say, I'm going to try to let him talk. He gets 5 minutes here, but the only domestic terrorism he knows is his good friends from the Proud Boys and fucking Boogaloos and shit. And terrorism he fucking facilitates. Piece of fucking dog shit.
I've witnessed how violent extremists from Antifa and others have made political violence on the streets of my home city, banal. Local politicians turn a
see
blind
that?
eye to
My home city of Portland, but he's got a British accent. And that seems like a really petty thing to focus on, but I can't listen, man. Like, I'm Gen X, and like I grew up watching like PBS would show like Monty Python, and I used to watch the Young Ones a lot, and I used to walk around and talk in an English accent all the time to like quote Monty Python, and it was really fun. And guess what? A lot of my like punk and goth friends, we used to do that too. But and some of us were better at it than others and whatever. But I can't. And the reason I bring that up is because I knew a couple people that did that, like in the goth community. A couple of different guys in different cities too. One in Reno, and I knew someone in Southern California who took on a fake, like took it to the extreme. Took that sitting around and telling Monty Python, reciting Monty Python lines with your fucking friends and stuff, or quoting the Young Ones, to kind of talking in that accent all the time. And it was annoying and stupid. But even those people, I can't imagine they would ever sit in front of fucking Congress with a fake accent, man. And this guy just admitted he's called it his hometown of Portland. So he is not born with a goddamn fucking British accent. And if he would come out and be that fucking surface level fake, that should tell you so much about what you need to know about this piece of shit lying grifter.
because they believed the extremism was a justified response to the surprise election win of Donald Trump. Local fellow journalists did the same in downplaying Antifa's violent extremism. Today, I ask that you don't do the same.
I gotta address that. So he anti-fascists didn't come out and commit violence because Trump got elected. What happened was a bunch of emboldened right-wing fascist fucking street thugs like Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys and Identity Europa and Rise Above movement felt emboldened by the Trump administration, started taking to the street literally like almost every weekend across the country to commit violence and to violently push their fascist right-wing agenda onto different communities. They repeatedly attacked Berkeley for a year or more, for a couple of years, in an attempt to get to create a stronghold in Berkeley of far-right fascism. And it didn't work. They got run out. And then they say, oh, the people that didn't allow us to commit violence unrestricted in your communities, they were just mad that Trump was elected. Has nothing to do with it. They came out, and listen, every time that these fascists did this shit, like in 2016 and 2017, they would march and rally in the streets, whether it was Portland or Boston or U.S. Capitol or in Berkeley or Oakland or San Francisco, whatever, wherever it was. And that night, all kinds of fucking violence would be done to trans people from the community, black women walking home late at night, businesses that had pro-BLM fucking signs in their fucking storefronts had their storefronts busted out. There would be a rampant fucking uptick of racially motivated property damage and violence against actual individuals from marginalized groups the night of these different rallies. So when anti-fascists came out in response in 2016 and 2017, it wasn't because they were mad about Trump being elected. That was the Woman's March in many ways. Okay, it wasn't just about that, but I know in 2016, that first Women's March was a big fucking fuck you to Donald Trump. But what anti-fascists were doing was not about, oh, we're mad because Donald Trump is president. It's we're terrified because he's emboldening these fascists to come out in the street and do violence against our communities. And anti-fascists came out and said, you know what? I'm going to put my body between you and the indigenous person or the trans person or the Mexican brown woman or the Latinx person or the LGBTQ person that you want to do violence to. I'm going to put my body between you and them. And then they ran home and went, oh, the Antifas were violent. They didn't let us just randomly run fucking through the streets and beat people. Now, they had a lot of fucking cops helping them with that effort and doing violence to the leftists that came out to defend their communities from these fascist violence. The cops facilitated them repeatedly in numerous cities. But mad because Trump? Fuck this fake accent lying motherfucker, man.
From 2016 through 2019, Portland and the surrounding area suffered dozens of violent protests, mass street brawls, and riots that resulted in serious bodily injuries, arson attacks, and property destruction. By 2020, Antifa exploited...
You notice that the people that testified before him provided specific dates and locations and names of organizations and places. He just said there was looting, or what did he say? Arson and property damage and bodily harm. But he gives no specific examples.
The anger around the death of George Floyd and others to launch an unprecedented attempted insurrection in Portland. For more than 120 recurring days, Antifa carried out nightly riots targeting federal, county, and private property. They developed a...
Absolutely not true. They came out and peacefully marched in defense of black lives and had massive militarized fucking police force fucking directed at them and fucking unmarked fucking federal fucking... I don't even know what you call them, fucking snatch you up off the street squads. But he wants to label that as damaging private property and riots and shit. You watch any of those fucking accounts in PDX, you watch the first moment any type of fucking violence happens, it's the cops doing it to people peacefully marching. This man is a lying, high-paid fascist grifter.
Apparatus that included streams of funding for accommodation, travel, riot gear, and weapons.
Streams of funding. See, again, what streams of funding? Give a specific example, Andy, no. What stream of fucking funding? This is an old trope, and it's a fucking lie that, you know, leftists and anti-fascists, the vast majority of us are incredibly poor, and we have no fucking funding as anti-capitalists from any fucking billionaire capitalist. No billionaire wants to give us money so that we could take it and turn around and use it to end his ability to be a fucking billionaire. There were no covert fucking funding streams. But this motherfucker takes a milkshake to the face, lies about it, and gets $200,000 out here talking about funding streams. All leftist organizing and funding thereof is made public and well known. And there are no wealthy fucking donors kicking us down. None. It's all straight up true grassroots. And not one of us has pulled down $200,000 on one fucking action. Not one of us. Motherfucker funding streams. Everything that full-on fascist grifters like this accuse the left of, they're guilty of. Always. All of it. Everything they accuse us of, they're projecting. And this is not like, oh, because they're, like it's some weird knee-jerk thing they do. This is a very tactical fucking methodology where it's, where they're weakest, they attack us. They come out and accuse us of what they are most guilty and where they're weakest on. So they demonize us and go, oh, you know, they have funding streams and it's all outside agitating, things that they're actually engaged in. So that when we turn back and go, no, you're the ones, it makes us look like we're going, you, and whatever, right? But literally, we have no fucking funding streams on the left. It's just not a thing, fam.
A murder, hundreds of arson attacks, mass injuries, and mass
in a murder. What murder?
To put that into context for those here today, similar actions that occurred at the Capitol Hill riot on the 6th of January 2021 were repeated every night, months on end in the Pacific Northwest.
That is absolutely demonstrably false. You cannot say that what happened in the Capitol on January 6th that happened even once, let alone every night in PDX. The people in PDX were not storming government buildings, trampling cops, and doing violence to cops. You will never see the video of anti-fascists full fucking swinging on cops in Portland. That is not a thing that happened. It happened in the Capitol. It happened in the Capitol. None of those PDX anti-fascists went at people and murdered people. They didn't chant USA as they trampled fucking government buildings. They took to the streets and had violence unleashed on them. Not even remotely the same fucking thing. That's why he gets paid big fucking bucks, though. And him going and testifying before Congress will make it easier to facilitate his grift.
Antifa and far-left extremists seized 6 blocks of city territory that they said was autonomous. It resulted in 6 shootings and 2 murders over a period of 3 weeks.
Note that he's not going to give you the specific, and I'm not going to go into it either, but each of those 6 things. Yes, there was violence that went down in Chas. But it wasn't a part of the mechanism, and it's not, there's violence and murders and random fucking robbings, and a lot of that is what it was. It was shit that went down in that place because there was a lot of people in there, and it was like flawed human beings are going to be a part of everything, but it wasn't part of the project. It wasn't part of, you see what I'm saying? It wasn't a tactical thing where they just decided, okay, now that we've taken Chaz, we can go around and start shooting people. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. And again, note that he doesn't provide any specific examples. He just throws out numbers and says things happened. Whereas the other people who testified gave very specific dates and names of groups and organizations and the dates on which they'd done things and their histories. He provides none of that context here.
In July 2020, then DHS Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli reported to Congress at a Senate hearing that at least 277 injuries have been inflicted on about 140 federal agents protecting the Mark O. Hatfield U.S. Courthouse in Portland. With my own eyes, I witnessed black-clad, masked militants setting fires to buildings occupied by people. The Antifa came on...
Bullshit. Where's the proof, Andy? You did not see that with your own eyes. But you have seen your fucking comrades plot violence against other people. But you don't have any video proof of all this shit you say you saw fucking, this illegal shit you saw leftists do, man. You don't have it. You're a lying motherfucker.
With homemade IEDs, guns, and
homemade
knives.
IEDs. Fuck you. Guns and knives.
Throwing projectiles like rocks, glass, and frozen water bottles. Some of them even brought electric power tools to cut apart the fencing that was set up to protect the courthouse. Andrew
you know that that's why they brought that, if they brought it.
Rioting charges allegedly possessed pipe bomb components and a machete at the time of his arrest. The
Allegedly.
following month, a self-described Antifa member hunted down a Trump supporter in downtown is shot and dead point blank before
That's
fleeing
bullshit.
out of state and being killed by federal authorities the following.
That's bullshit. He did not hunt anyone down, man. That dude was fucking walking in the other direction, and that Patriot Prayer motherfucker walked up on him, shot him with mace, after fucking macing and doing violence to people all fucking day, and that motherfucker in self-defense shot that Patriot Prayer piece of shit. And then fucking Trump sent out a literal fucking death squad and shot that dude, Reinhold, that anti-fascist fucking righteous as fuck comrade, cold-blooded, murdered him in the street. Fred Hampton him in the fucking street, man. Murdered him. He did not track down, stalk that Patriot Prayer motherfucker. It was the other way around. God, what a disgusting lying piece of shit this guy is.
Week. He left behind a trail of posts on his social media indicating his desire for an armed conflict with the state, which he viewed as fascist.
No, he did not. No, he did not. He called for fucking revolution. He never called for a fucking armed confrontation with the state. That's a fucking lie.
Important subject of domestic terrorism. But I'm concerned that our representatives are increasingly viewing this through a partisan lens. This puts all Americans at risk. Those speaking before and after.
And it's not partisan. It's not a partisan lens. Okay? It's not about Republican and Democrat. Every fucking member of the Republican Party is full on fucking given over to fascism now. Okay? But they're not necessarily the fascist street thug terrorists. There's groups that have, interlocking relationships and whatever. But it's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's full-on fucking fascist right-wing terrorists, and what extremes and levels of extremism do they have, and how far are we willing to go to defend ourselves from them?
On far-right terrorism, a threat extremely well tracked by government agencies, nonprofits, and journalists. Much less understood is the terrorism threat from the far left, particularly Antifa. Far-left terrorism isn't new in the U.S. It has a long history in the second half of the 20th century.
No, it does
where
not.
Groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and the...
Okay, Weather Underground and Black Liberation Army were not anti-fascist organizations. Every fucking anti-fascist I know, even though we might be a little enamored by some of the stuff that the audacity of the Weather Underground, we do understand that that's a tactic that does not work. And we will honestly and feverishly tell our comrades, if we even hear hints of them trying to suggest something that's even reminiscent of what the Weather Underground did, they will always be universally struck down by more adept and knowledgeable comrades. Not for rhetorical purposes, but again, because we know, one, it will not achieve the revolution, and two, it facilitates the mechanisms of power's ability to further foment or to further put in place laws that restrict us and subjugate and oppress already oppressed and marginalized people. Antifa, Black Liberation Army, and Weather Underground are all three completely different organizations. But he wants to tie anti-fascists to the Weather Underground because they actually did bombings. He just lied and said that Reinhold repeatedly used social media to call for an armed fucking confrontation, which is an absolute lie. He never did that. And then he invokes the Weather Underground and Black Liberation Army. Again, not groups have anything to do with anti-fascists, never carried the banner of Antifa.
A19 communist organization carried out bombings, robberies, and jailbreaks in the name of anti-racism. Antifa are continuing that legacy today and use the cloak.
No, we're not. We're doing bombings. What did he say? We're doing bombings, huh? We're carrying on that legacy, is what he said. What did he say?
Where groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and the May 19 Communist Organization carried out bombings, robberies, and jailbreaks in the name of anti-racism. Antifa are continuing that legacy today.
Jailbreaks.
Use a cloak of anti-fascism.
So us advocating for freedom all is jailbreaks and robberies. Anti-fascists do not commit robberies, not one jailbreak, not one fucking robbery, and none of this shit that he says that this other group did for against in the name of anti-racism. Again, I'm not familiar with the history of the Black Liberation Army, so I can't really speak to them, but I'm going to imagine that it wasn't, hey, let's go rob a bank because anti-racism. Hey, let's go do violence because we hate racism. I'm sure it was much more nuanced and different than that. And I'm sure because Andy No is saying it's a lie, because what he's saying, the connections that he's making to other groups, I know to be a lie by firsthand account and knowledge. So I think it's fair to assume that his framing of the Black Liberation Army is false. Again, I don't know because I haven't spent the time to really study them properly. But to say that Antifa is now carrying on a tradition of robberies and jailbreaks, it's bullshit. Just there's no robberies or jailbreaks. We're marching to advocate for the freeing of political prisoners and people incarcerated during COVID and not being provided the things that they need to survive during COVID in prisons and shit. But ain't nobody tried to break anybody out, man. This lying motherfucker.
Shield themselves from criticism and to fool well-meaning people into becoming allies. In September 2020, FBI Director Chris Wray told lawmakers that Antifa is real and that the FBI investigates the threat coming from violent anarchist extremists who identify with Antifa. We should heed his warnings. Domestic terrorism is not partisan. Both the far left and the far right seek to delegitimize and destabilize the republic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ah, Jesus Christ. Okay, so, you know, people like Andy No couldn't exist if they're like their whole fucking model is built on demonizing the left. So basically, people like us are his bread and butter. It's kind of gross, you know, like, and Black Lives Matter activists and indigenous rights activists and trans rights activists that he demonizes, like, he makes money off that. And I think, I don't know about Andy No, but I know with a lot of these fucking people, the reason they hate us so much is because they know they can't fucking hang with us. That we don't want them around and they're fucking emotionally fucking distraught over it. They want to be in our club and they can't. And the reason they want to be in our club is because it's real. The vast majority of people on this planet are poor and working class. And the vast majority of people on this planet aren't cis hetero white males. The vast majority of amazing arts and culture comes from intersectional communities and diversity, fam, for lack of a less cliche term, but not from high-paid fascist propagandists propping up fucking historic white supremacy and demonizing anyone that would defend our communities from it, that would risk themselves and their own well-being in defense of those more marginalized and more vulnerable than themselves. Like, it's just, I think that this is all indicative of a final collapse. I don't think that this can really be sustained for another decade, let alone decades. And I think that it's really important that we, as leftists, be involved in some type of organizing with some type of anti-capitalist, communist, anarchist group, org, or party, whether it's, you know, joining a communist party or joining a Food Not Bombs collective or some type of, you know, anarchist mutual aid network or, but it needs to be anti-capitalist, and you need to be organizing and working with other comrades and other anti-capitalist fam, because it's those groups and it's that type of organizing and solidarity that is going to replace these crumbling mechanisms of capitalism. And we're the majority that pieces of shit like Andy No and the other fuckfaces who wishes they could be us are terrified of. And anyway, I have picked out here. This is the Stuck Ups. The first track is dedicated to those who wish they could be us but never will be, so they hate us. It's called Baby's Got a Heart On.